All right. Welcome, everybody, to this month's edition of the Let's Talk series, brought to you by the Visiting Nurses and Hospice of Vermont and New Hampshire. I am the Community Relations Manager, Anthony Knox, and I am here today with Annie Hutchinson of Gifford Medical Center. So, Annie, why don't you just take a few minutes and introduce yourself?
Yeah. So thanks everyone for joining today, and thanks Anthony for inviting me to present. As you said, my name is Annie. I'm a dietitian here at Gifford. I've been a dietitian for a little over 4.5 years, and have background in a couple different places. So started off my career working for the Federal Women, Infant, and Children program. So kind of focused on kids under 5 and then pregnant, postpartum, and breastfeeding women. I've also worked briefly in nutrition support, so supporting people who are not able to consume food orally, so either need tube feeds or fed through an IV. And then now have found my way back to Vermont. I was living in Washington State for a little bit, so happy to be back home. And I was working for the state of Vermont again with the WIC program, and now am focused just on outpatient counseling. So my main interests with my patients is trying to provide patient-centered care as much as possible, and have a really big interest in helping people to heal their relationship with food. I think that a lot of our struggles either with restriction or overindulging can come from a dysfunctional background or history with our relationship with food. So just to give you a little bit of background on me and my journey in my nutrition career, that's where I'm at right now. So ready for the slides anytime.
Excellent. So for those of you watching live, feel free to ask any questions in the comment box, and we'll be able to answer them in real time. And today's presentation is Fad Diet. So Annie, I'm going to let you take it over from here. And again, anybody watching live, please ask your questions, and Annie's ready and willing to answer them. So.
Yeah, and I should say, to add on to Anthony's comments about asking questions, I am a pretty informal presenter. That's the way I prefer to present. So definitely, put your questions in. I can see the comments and I can answer them, as I go along. That's not a problem for me at all. So I chose the topic of fad diets just because I think it's kind of more of a niche topic in nutrition that people tend to have a lot of questions about. There's a lot of confusion about, which fad diet is healthy versus not healthy. And so I just wanted to go over, a general overview, and then I'll also talk about some specific examples of fad diets just to give people some information. I should say that this presentation is based just towards general population. Of course, there's nuances in everything. And so there's certainly not black and white. I'm just presenting the research as we know it currently, which is, of course, always changing. So just a little outline of today's presentation. I'm going to start off just by defining what a fad diet is so that we're all on the same page as far as what we're referring to when we say the term fad diet. I'll give a brief history of fad diets because they have been around for a long time. And I think it was kind of fun for me to go through some research and look at what historically has been popular. I'll talk about some drawbacks of fad diets, give some specific examples, as I said, of some fad diets that are pretty popular nowadays. And then lastly, go through some tips on how to live healthfully and hopefully, free yourself from any certain dietary constraints, granted that you're able to do that. So to start off, a fad diet is, as Merriam-Webster defines a fad, a practice or interest followed for a time with exaggerated zeal. So as this applies to diets, often these diets tend to be really trendy for a short period of time. People are really kind of all or nothing into them. Often celebrities promote fad diets a lot, so that kind of increases the popularity of them, the amount that, people are talking about them on social media and other media outlets. These diets often are sold as a way of eating that promote very quick and dramatic weight loss. And they tend to be very restrictive, often cutting out entire food groups or having a pretty narrow range of foods that you're able to eat as, prescribed by such diets. There's often little research that goes into the claims that are being made about these diets promoted. And so, the claims may just be based off of one person's experience with that particular diet. So all things to keep in mind when you're, reading about nutrition. If anything that is being claimed kind of seems too good to be true, lifestyle change does take often a while to maintain that. And changing our bodies doesn't happen overnight or in a couple weeks. So if it seems too good to be true, it often is. And so with this definition in mind, I would encourage you when you're doing reading about nutrition to kind of think about, like, is this a fad diet? Is this something that's a little more legit? And we will talk about, there's some examples in this picture here. So we'll talk about some specific examples down the road.
So Annie, before we continue on, so one question that I had related to what you were just talking about is that, so fad diets are not necessarily, signed off by any sort of governing body that this is, legit, quote unquote, or anything like that, versus, we've all seen and heard of the food pyramid and, how much of this we should be ingesting, every day and things like that. So can you just talk, briefly, if possible, about kind of how the quote unquote food pyramid and, is determined and, where, what governing body just kind of says that this is what a person of this height, weight, age should be eating, on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. So things such as the food pyramid are determined based off of what are called the dietary guidelines for Americans. So every 5 years, an expert committee is put together by the USDA, and they go through, lots of evidence, particularly peer-reviewed journals, which tend to be the most rigorous evidence that's out there. And then based on, the current evidence at the time that they're reviewing it, they'll develop general guidelines for healthy eating, and exercise is also included in that. So yeah, those are updated every 5 years. And then those guidelines are what inform things such as what previously used to be the food pyramid. Currently, it's the graphic, I guess, that kind of demonstrates what we call a healthy meal is called My Plate. And so that's the USDA kind of went away from the food pyramid and developed My Plate as a visual of, what each meal should look like. And to kind of just briefly touch on that, it includes half your plate being fruits and vegetables, about a quarter grains, with an emphasis on trying to incorporate as much whole grains as possible. The other quarter is some kind of protein. So whether that is a animal-based protein or plant-based protein, such as, tofu, and then dairy on the side as well. So those are all, as I said, informed by the dietary guidelines for Americans.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So just to go through a brief history of fad diets, I put together this little timeline, and I'll include some in between too that I found interesting. So in my research, it was kind of unclear exactly when the first official fad diet was, but one of the first that I was able to find was in 1864. So a gentleman named William Banting, who was actually an undertaker, wrote a letter that was called the Letter on Corpulence, which highlighted dangers of living in a larger body. And he was promoting the first low carbohydrate diet. So this was promoted by him because he had lost a large amount of weight following this dietary pattern, where he was mostly eating meat or fish and vegetables. And so on the timeline is just a picture of the title page of this. But I just thought that was kind of interesting that, it was an undertaker who wrote this. I think that through his observations, he was just seeing that people's body types were changing over time. And so it was something he was curious about. And so kind of did this self-experiment on weight loss. The next timeline shows in the 1920s, so it's there on the bottom, and it's an ad for cigarettes that says, "To keep a slender figure, no one can deny, reach for a lucky instead of a sweet." And so in the 20s, cigarette smoking was promoted pretty heavily as a way to suppress appetite and lose weight, which cigarette smoking does suppress appetite. However, we know now, the dangers to our overall health of smoking cigarettes. So it's just kind of interesting looking back and how, back then we were less informed about those dangers. And so we're using it as a way to promote, a certain body type. In the 1930s, so this isn't on the timeline, but I thought it was kind of an interesting one to highlight. The grapefruit diet is also referred to as the Hollywood diet, was widely promoted, and it was believed that eating a grapefruit before every meal would help you to burn fat. There's no evidence to support that grapefruits do that. Perhaps there could have been a connection to having an overall lower weight, and that's probably related to eating something that's high in fiber and water and kind of, staving off hunger in that way rather than something magical about the grapefruit that burns fat. In the 1940s, so specifically in 1941, an alternative health enthusiast named Stanley Burroughs created something called the Master Cleanse. So many of you may have heard of this, and there's probably different names for it, but on the top of the timeline, it's just that picture of the mason jar with some lemon slices in it and a pile of cayenne pepper next to it. So his claim was that by drinking a mixture of either lemon or lime juice, maple syrup, water, and cayenne pepper 6 times a day for 10 days, you would eliminate cravings for junk food, alcohol, tobacco, and drugs. And, this has kind of remained relatively popular. I think it's gotten through waves. But again, not convincing evidence that this claim is true and that it will eliminate cravings for such foods or substances. In the 1960s, so shown on the bottom, there's a guy eating a rack of ribs, I think. The drinking man's diet was promoted. This was particularly targeted at men, and it was a low carbohydrate diet, but allowed you to drink as much alcohol as you wanted. So just kind of, again, something that is interesting is that, alcohol is not necessarily something we promote large intakes of. So for a diet to just say, yeah, go for it, drink as much alcohol as you'd like, is counterintuitive to the evidence, or counter to the evidence that we have now. In the 1990s, the Atkins diet was developed by a cardiologist. And this is, another example of low carbohydrate diets. You're probably noticing a trend that tends to be a really popular nutrient to restrict. And so this is low carbohydrate, but fairly moderate protein and fat intake, and is a little bit more flexible than some more modern day carbohydrate diets that I'll touch on a bit later. And then the last one, in the early 2000s that was widely promoted, I want to say it was by like Jennifer Aniston or some celebrity, was the baby food diet. So rather than eating solid food, it was promoted to eat baby foods throughout the day, and eating up to 14 jars, which, not to say that baby food is bad for you, I just personally feel like it's probably not as satisfying as, cooking like a nice roasted chicken with vegetables, or something of that nature. So just kind of an interesting way of eating that was promoted.
So Annie, real quick, in talking about the history of fad diets, two of the 5 or 6 that you just mentioned had to do with citrus fruits.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything in relation to citrus fruits that is some sort of health benefit, things like that? I mean, again, it obviously it seems odd that 2 of the fad diets, and obviously the juice cleanse stuff still seems to be prevalent today. But is there any sort of merit around citrus fruits as it relates to diet?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a very good observation. So, as far as the evidence that we have right now, there's nothing related to any compounds in citrus fruits that burn fat or whatnot, which were the claims that were being made about the grapefruit in particular. Citrus fruits, generally pretty low calorie. They are high in fiber, which is good for overall health, and then offer vitamin C. So they certainly have health benefits, not to diminish those, but there's not necessarily something in citrus fruits that is, unlocking the key to health or having a certain body type or something like that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Great question.
Perfect.
Okay, so to talk about some drawbacks of fad diets. So as I kind of touched on earlier, they often are highly restrictive, cutting out entire food groups, only allowing you to eat a certain small list of foods. So often this results in a less sustainable lifestyle change. People can often follow these really strict diets for short periods of time. But what happens when you're not able to sustain that anymore? And the result often is that 80 to 95% of these dieters regain the weight that they had lost while they were following this fad diet. One potential reason for this is that prolonged calorie restriction can lower your metabolism. So that makes it harder to maintain your weight once you lose it. And if we think about this from, a physiological standpoint, that makes sense. If your body thinks it's in starvation mode, we're going to hang on to the calories that we have, which lowering metabolism is one way. Or, thinking back to our days of hunting and gathering, if we didn't know when the next buffalo would come along, our bodies were trained to really conserve the calories that we did have available, so that we could continue to produce the energy we needed. Fad diets also don't address someone's relationship with food and exercise. So going back to what I was saying at the beginning, and the way that I like to practice and I think really promotes sustainable lifestyle changes is that, you can follow this for a certain period of time. But again, when you go back to your old patterns of eating, particularly if you tend to have problems with unconscious eating, so eating when you feel bored, or if you feel certain emotions or stress and you turn to food, and aren't checking in with your hunger signals, fad diets aren't going to address that and can sometimes even make those problems worse once you return to normal patterns of eating because you've restricted yourself for so long. So really focusing on lasting behavior modifications often is more sustainable versus just focusing on numbers. So whether that's weight, whether that's calorie counting, and stuff like that, again, can work in the short term, but often not something people want to do for their entire lives. I did want to touch on a couple of the visuals here. So the diet cycle is something that's kind of small, so it's hard to see. But it just highlights, you diet for a period of time, your body goes into its famine response. So that's when you have the lower metabolism, and you tend to, really hang on to calories. So it's really fighting, that type of weight loss and that type of restriction. So then sometimes you'll go back into, the kind of feast response where your body's feeling really deprived and you're wanting to eat more. So increase in intake, and then, kind of might go into a weight cycling where you regain some of the weight you lost. One prime example of this is on the show The Biggest Loser. So a lot of people have probably heard of it, but in case you haven't, it's a show where people who are living in larger bodies go on in a kind of a competition to lose the most weight. And they are, dedicated for, I'm not exactly sure how long it is. I want to say it's like 6 months or 3 months, but pretty short period of time where, people tend to lose 200 pounds or, like a very large amount of weight, and really are dedicated during that period of time just to exercising and dieting. So many of the participants who are on this show tend to regain a large percentage of the weight that they had lost, and sometimes will even go above the weight that they had started the show at. And a lot of the studies that have been done, because this was kind of like an interesting phenomenon for researchers. So a lot of the studies show that these folks' metabolisms progressively got even slower after they had lost all that weight. And so some former contestants were eating 800 calories a day just to maintain where they were. Just to give you an idea, typically people need somewhere between like 1,600 to 2,000 calories. So that's a deficit of like 50%. So half of what we're expected to eat is what these people had to eat just to maintain their weight. And then of course you can run into potential nutrient deficiencies, because if you only have this small amount of calorie intake you can have, you're not able to eat enough variety. And that's also just not a very fun or sustainable way to live your life when you have to focus that much on what you're eating. Another, in addition kind of to the metabolic changes, there's a hypothesis that there's also changes to hormones that allow us to feel hunger and fullness when we do restrict for so long and lose those large amounts of weight. So just kind of some food for thought, when you're thinking of setting any goals as far as your weight is concerned. Our bodies certainly can fight weight loss, and often does. There's a weight that our bodies try to maintain, and so trying to go against that can be a really big challenge. All right. So to discuss the specific examples, I wanted to start off by talking about the ketogenic diet. This is something that over the past several years has gained in popularity. I think there's a lot of different versions of it. And so I did just want to touch on that specific diet during this presentation. So the ketogenic diet is a diet characterized by very high fat content, moderate protein content, and low carbohydrate content. So depending on which version you follow will depend on what the fat content is, but anywhere up to 90% of calories are consumed from fat. The dietary guidelines for Americans, the recommendation is 20 to 30% from fat. So that's a pretty big difference when we're thinking about those numbers. The limit of carbohydrates is anywhere from 20 to 50 grams per day. And to just give you a reference point with food, a cup of cooked pasta is 45 grams. So that's almost the entire day of carbohydrates just in one, would be one meal. A baked potato is about 40 grams of carbs. A piece of fruit, which is generally a very healthy option, is often 15, but bananas are a little higher. They are, looking at my cheat sheet here, about 30 to 45 grams for a banana. So, again, very restrictive when it comes to carbohydrates. So what happens when you restrict carbohydrates is, rather than our body running on glucose, which is the form of carbohydrate or sugar that our body gets energy from, it synthesizes something called a ketone body, which is made from breaking down fat cells. This diet was initially created as a therapeutic diet for people with epilepsy. So often what will happen with a lot of times kids that have epilepsy is, if they're unable to control the amount of seizures they have from medication, then they'll try the ketogenic diet. And it does have really good success in that population. So the reason that this diet works in the short term is your body reaches what's called a state of ketosis, where you are running just on the ketone bodies rather than glucose. And often your weight drops a lot at the beginning. The reason for this is that the storage form of glucose, which is called glycogen, I won't get too in the weeds of biochemistry here, but it bounds up the storage form of glucose in water. So a lot of the weight that you initially lose is because of fluid. And then, sometimes people experience a plateau, which can be really frustrating for them. Some potential risks of the ketogenic diet is that it can incorporate high intakes of saturated fat. This type of fat is associated with greater risk of high cholesterol and heart disease. And so, if you're not being deliberate about the types of fat you're consuming, it can be really high in saturated fat. There's also a higher potential for kidney stones. You can experience constipation because you are limiting a lot of high fiber foods, which often come from whole grains, fruit, and vegetables, as though those are all pretty high carbohydrate foods, although they are all, very healthy for you. Because you're limiting really nutrient dense foods like fruits and vegetables, so they contain a lot of vitamins and minerals. There is potential risk for nutrient deficiencies. And then kind of more of a very acute symptom of this diet is something called the keto flu. So that's just your body's response to running off of the ketone bodies rather than glucose. It just can vary in symptoms from fatigue. You can feel like you have the flu, so runny nose, and often it's not very pleasant for some people. I did also want to give the caveat that people with certain health conditions should not ever follow the keto diet. So these conditions include any pancreatic diseases, liver diseases, thyroid, or gallbladder. And it can be extremely risky for people who have diabetes, particularly type 1, because it can increase their risk to develop a condition which is called ketoacidosis. So again, not trying to get too into the weeds, but what that is that ketone bodies are acidic compounds. So basically it makes your blood acidic, which is not good for your overall organs and body. So I did just want to throw that out there as a warning, if anyone was thinking of following the keto diet and has those conditions, definitely avoid that. So With all that said, the keto diet can work in the short term for some people if their goal is to lose weight, but because of its restrictive nature and potential side effects, I definitely think that those are worth considering when you're thinking about making any dietary changes.
So Annie, can you elaborate though a little bit on the therapeutic effects of this for someone with epilepsy, and just kind of explain as to why this is a therapeutic diet for
Yeah,
them?
yeah.
That just, I guess my biggest question is, why would somebody with epilepsy benefit from this diet potentially?
Right. So, um, as far as explaining the exact mechanism, I don't know that I can get that in the weeds with it, but there's something about the way that ketones interact with the brain that help to decrease the type of neuroactivity that promotes seizures. It's kind of the proposed mechanism. And often it's not super long term. It's for, like, I think I read somewhere a max of 2 years is what's recommended. And then they'll go back to eating a more normal diet. This is not super well studied as far as how it impacts us if we follow it for a very long period of time, or even, a short period of time. Kind of the long-term impacts of it on a general population is not well known. With, kiddos that have epilepsy, I think often with chronic health conditions like that, you have to weigh the pros and cons of any therapies that you're going to offer. So it appears that this benefit outweighs any potential side effects, and has been shown that in these kids, they tend to not have a lot of long-term side effects from following the ketogenic diet, but that's in a very specific subpopulation. So, certainly any evidence for the general population doesn't support that it's safe long term at this point in time. We just don't have enough information about it.
Okay, perfect.
All righty. So the second fad diet I wanted to touch on, and this is kind of, I wanted to pick this because it's a little bit on the opposite spectrum of the keto diet, is juice cleanses. So this consists of drinking only freshly squeezed fruit and vegetable juices, often for several days at a time. This can be an easy way to add fruits and vegetables to your diet. However, it does remove the fiber from them. And this, fiber, it's one of the reasons why we promote fruits and vegetables. It has a lot of benefits to the body. Not only does it promote regularity of your GI tract and your bowels, but it also helps to prevent against high cholesterol levels. It can help kind of normalize those. It also helps to satiate our hunger. So, when you eat something that has fiber, it slows the overall digestion so that we just feel more satisfied after we have that fiber containing food. And then to kind of go along with that, it does slow the entry of sugar into our blood, so prevents, very dramatic blood sugar spikes as well. Juice cleanses also lack fat and protein, so that's what I was kind of referring to as it being the opposite end of the spectrum to the keto diet. Is it's pretty much all carbohydrate. So fat and protein are, in addition to fiber, are also components of food that help us to feel more satisfied, in the long term. Our bodies also don't register liquid calories in the same way that it registers solid calories. There's been a lot of studies looking at people who drink something such as, a sugar sweetened beverage like soda or juice. And what they find is that our bodies do often compensate, in the way of registering that we've had additional calories when we eat them, but not in the same way as when we drink them. So this, could lead to, you drink this huge juice that's equivalent to a meal, but you're not feeling hungry. So may perhaps drink more juice or, end up basically consuming more calories than you would by eating the foods whole. There's also no evidence to support any claims that, by juicing a fruit or vegetable, the vitamins and minerals are better absorbed, or that drinking juice detoxifies the body beyond, what our internal organs, such as our liver or kidneys, do. So, again, in the same realm as other fad diets, extremely restrictive, often doesn't satisfy our hunger, and just not sustainable in the long term. So, yeah. I tacked in a little bit about Weight Watchers. This is one that is sort of a fad diet. I think it's been around for a really long time. So I just wanted to touch on that and, kind of go through the pros and cons of Weight Watchers. So I will say that Weight Watchers does promote a more holistic approach to health. So their focus is on both diet and exercise. And, I think that is something to certainly commend Weight Watchers about, is trying to promote lifestyle changes. Some folks do find the community aspect very helpful. But on the flip side, some people, that kind of makes them feel uncomfortable. Like, okay, I have to go confess to this group of people that, maybe I didn't have the same outcomes that they did. And so it can make people feel ashamed to go to the meetings. It does promote gradual weight loss, which is often a more sustainable way to lose weight, and has focuses on things like portion control that tend to be a little bit more applicable in the long term. Some drawbacks is that it can be expensive over time. So, not something that you'll probably want to pay for throughout your whole life. And then also the constant tracking of points does inherently put foods on a value-based system. So, it could lead people to feeling restricted if they're only choosing the lower point options. I think it's, of course, all foods have different pros and cons to them. But, deliberately tracking them in this way with the points can lead to that kind of restrictive cycle. And then for some folks, tracking points consistently for long periods of time can lead to disordered eating patterns, where, eating kind of controls all of your life, your social life, stuff like that. So, certainly something that, again, can work in the short term or for a little while, but probably not sustainable for someone throughout their whole lives. And it's likely just not going to work for everyone. A one-size-fits-all approach, unfortunately, does not exist, because we are all so different, come from different backgrounds, have differing abilities as far as, food preparation, different abilities to purchase certain foods. So, certainly not something that I would promote heavily for everyone. All right. So, to kind of tie things up, what are some ways to live a health-filled life? So as I've kind of highlighted a couple different times throughout this presentation, the most sustainable way to achieve overall health and wellness is through focusing on positive lifestyle habits. I touched on this a little bit earlier too, but each person's weight is influenced by so many different factors. So genetics is one. As I said, we all kind of have a set point weight where our body tries to stay around, and will often fight decreasing from that. So it can be a challenge for people who are really trying to lose weight. And that's not necessarily a reflection on you personally. It's often just a reflection on your genetics, your body, your physiology, and how that all interacts. If you're not comfortable with your current weight, even just modest changes of 5 to 10% can have meaningful impacts on health. And again, that focus on lifestyle, those are still going to have a net positive impact on your health, even if that doesn't lead to any changes in body size or weight. consider some of the reasons that you might not be exercising regularly or eating certain foods. Maybe you just haven't found the right recipe. So eating foods that you enjoy, trying to prepare them in a new and different way, if that's something you're able to do. There's so many resources online now. That's, one of the many beauties of having access to so much information is, can be a blessing and a curse, but we have access to so many different recipes. So just trying something in a way that you haven't before may, make you love foods that once you thought you would never like Brussels sprouts. I know I never ate those until I was in college, and now it's one of my favorite foods. Trying to focus on foods that you can add to your diet rather than what you should restrict. So I think that can be a really empowering thing for people. Like, focusing on the positive, I guess. What is this going to add to my diet versus like, oh, bummer, I have to eat, salad versus a cheeseburger. And so I think that can be a really good way to just shift your perspective a little bit on, dietary changes. Trying to find some type of physical activity that you really enjoy and look forward to doing. The more that you enjoy it, the more you are to continue to be physically active and integrate that into your everyday life. So that looks different for everybody. I found this great picture that I thought was cool when I wanted to talk about, joyful movement, joyful exercise, is this couple hula hooping. So think of things you enjoyed as a kid in gym class or, on the playground. And there's no rules that you can't continue to do stuff like hula hooping or jump roping as an adult, having a dance party at night when you're cooking dinner, or trying to go out for a walk to enjoy nature. Just trying to really think about things that you enjoy doing and the reasons behind it can help tap into your motivation, and help you figure out something that's going to work really well for you long term. And lastly, adequate sleep is so important for not just, eating healthy and being able to stay physically active, but for so many different areas of our health. When you don't sleep as well, often you feel fatigued, which can lead to feeling stressed. And stress sometimes can make us feel hungrier. It can also impact those hunger-related hormones. And so when we're underslept, we may not have the ability to tell when we're feeling hungry or full. Often not having as much energy, either to be physically active or even to just prepare a meal. Sometimes when we're feeling really tired, we'll turn towards something that's the most convenient, which is okay from time to time, but day after day, when you're nourishing yourself in that way, it tends to make you not feel super great long term. So focusing on having a good night's sleep sometimes can be a huge game changer for people. So with that, certainly open to any questions that you guys have, but that's all I have prepared for you guys today. And I hope that I was able to provide you with some good information moving forward.
Oh, that was great, Annie. And for anybody who may have questions after this presentation, anybody who's watching this as the recording on YouTube, don't hesitate to leave comments right on the YouTube page, and we'll make sure that we get them to Annie, and she'd be able to potentially reach out. Again, Annie is up at Gifford Medical Center. If anybody wants to schedule some time to meet with her, give her a call, and she'd be happy to work with you. And again, Annie, the presentation, we did have one comment. That's yes, we did discuss keto diet during the presentation. So once the recording is up in YouTube, it's towards the middle of the presentation. So if you jump ahead probably 20 minutes, you'll get right there. and get some information about keto diets. But with that, Annie, I want to thank you for providing this presentation during the Let's Talk series, and I'll be calling you up again if we have more dietary related conversations that we need to have for sure. So
perfect. Well, it was a lot of fun, and I appreciate everyone for tuning in. And Anthony, thank you for inviting me to chat today.
Awesome. All right. Thank you all for those of you who watched it live, and anybody who is going to be watching this recording afterwards. We'll be back next month with another presentation from the Let's Talk series. So thank you all, and enjoy your day.